The winter of 1942 to 1943 was one of the darkest periods of the Second World War. It was a winter that stretched for months, a bitter cold that froze the vast Russian steppe, and the desperate struggle of two great armies were locked in a deathly embrace. Trapped in the midst of a frozen wasteland was the German Sixth Army, led by the now infamous Field Marshal Paulus. It was here that the greatest defeat in German military history at that point would take place, a defeat that would devastate the German war effort and change the course of World War II. It had all started so promisingly for Paulus. He had been entrusted with the capture of the Russian city of Stalingrad, the gateway to the Caucasus oil fields. With a massive force of over 250,000 men, the German Sixth Army had pushed the Russians back, and by the end of November had reached the outskirts of the city. It seemed as if Paulus was on the brink of a great victory, one that surely would be remembered for generations. But then, as winter set in and his army entered the city, the tide began to turn. The once vibrant Stalingrad was reduced to rubble by months of hard fighting. The German offensive became bogged down in snow and ice, and Russian forces began to encircle Paulus and trap him inside the city. Despite the offensive starting off so well, the Germans were slowly strangled by the freezing cold and relentless Russian attacks. The Sixth Army was slowly being cut off from supplies, and with no hope of reinforcements, their fate seemed sealed. By the end of January, Paulus had been forced to surrender. With the fall of Stalingrad, the German war effort had been dealt a crippling blow from which it would never recover. It was a bitter end for Paulus and his army, and a defeat that would haunt the German military for years to come. Frederick Paulus was born on September 23, 1890, to a working-class family. In 1909, he tried to enlist in the German Naval Academy, but his application was rejected due to his family's social standing. Instead, Paulus decided to study law at the University of Marburg, but his true passion was serving in the military. In 1910, he stopped studying law and joined the German Officer Corps. In 1914, upon the outbreak of World War I, Paulus was the rank of lieutenant. Throughout World War I, Paulus served in France, Romania, and Serbia as a staff officer for the Alpine Corps, an elite mountain division. The future field marshal spent the war mostly behind a desk, working as a staff officer. Paulus was well liked by his superiors for being a studious organizer. After World War I, Paulus served as an officer in the Freikorps, where he took command of the 13th Infantry Regiment. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, he served in various positions behind the scenes. There was very little known about Paulus during these years. He was a private man, and he did not take part or share his opinion about the rise of Hitler or the state of Germany as a whole. Paulus followed the Prussian tradition of staying apolitical, despite being a good organizer. Friends of Paulus said later in life that he was meek and afraid of confrontation. His commanding officer stated that once he left the confines of an office that he lacked decisiveness, which the Prussian officer corps viewed as a fatal flaw. In 1934, Paulus took command of the motor transport units, and then in 1935 was promoted to colonel and placed as chief of staff for all motorized forces in Berlin. Due to Paulus's likability, he passed over Heinz Guderian, an extremely argumentative general, as chief of staff. In 1939, upon the outbreak of World War II, Paulus was considered an expert in mechanized warfare and was then tasked with training 4 tank divisions. While training these mechanized divisions, Paulus developed a close relationship with Adolf Hitler, who took Paulus under his wing. Paulus viewed Hitler as a patron and ally while serving in the chief of staff. Paulus felt isolated from the rest of the German high command, who were made up of Prussian nobility. Hitler, who also came from a middle-class background, was his ally and helped him navigate through the sea of aristocratic elites. Upon the outbreak of World War II, the invasion of Poland in 1939, Paulus served under Walter von Reichenau, who was a ruthless general who had little regard for staff work. Paulus became a surrogate son to Reichenau during the invasion of Poland and in the Phony War from 1939 to 1940. While Reichenau led his men into battle, Paulus did the paperwork and battle planning. Paulus became indispensable to the Sixth Army. Paulus participated in the sweeping victories in northern France and Belgium and took part in the planning phases of Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, and in September 1940 was tasked with help planning for Operation Barbarossa. After planning Barbarossa, he went to North Africa to observe Rommel and report his findings back to the German High Command. While in Africa, Paulus criticized the Africa Corps and Rommel's performance. He did this in an attempt to get Rommel's job. Paulus, by this point in the war, was desperate to get a command of his own. He was tired of sitting on the sidelines as other generals got the laurels of victory. After returning from Africa, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and Paulus was given orders to conduct a strategic survey of the Eastern Front to give directly to Hitler. Hitler. In his report, Paulus argued that the main threat for the German army was not failing to capture Moscow or allowing the Red Army to escape into the interior of the country, but the Russian winter and the strangling of German supply lines. Hitler ignored Paulus's observations and pocketed the survey, but he grew to respect Paulus for his honesty, and when Reichenau suggested that Paulus placed in command of the Sixth Army in his stead after a heart attack, Hitler agreed. Paulus took command of the Sixth Army in January 1942 and led his troops in the Battle of Propavos, where his men were halted by a Soviet counteroffensive, which forced the Sixth Army to retreat to a defensive position. Upon taking command, Paulus got rid of the Severity Order, which at least on paper ended the execution of Jews and Soviet POWs. Despite banning executions, the Sixth Army still committed a litany of war crimes in their march to Stalingrad. In May, Soviet General Timoshenko attacked the Sixth Army with 600,000 men at their defensive line at Velichonsk. Outnumbered and outgunned, Paulus ordered his men to retreat into the city of Kharkov. In what would later be known as the Second Battle of Kharkov, General Paul von Kessel came in for the rescue with the 1st Panzer Division, which smashed into Timoshenko's southern flank. By May 20th, Paulus' Sixth Army recovered and counterattacked into Timoshenko's line. The Red Army crumbled with over 250,000 men killed or taken prisoner. By June, the offensive resumed, with the Sixth Army pushing towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus with an army of 250,000 men. The march to the city was plagued with logistical difficulties, most notably the fuel situation. Army Group A had priority and were given most of the fuel. By July, Paulus had run out of gas and was forced to wait till mid-August to continue the offensive. Only a few weeks later, the Sixth Army ran out of fuel once again, with Paulus only 35 miles from the city of Stalingrad. In a desperate attempt at taking the city, he transferred the remaining oil to his only Panzer Division, which raced ahead of the rest of the army. Paulus's gambit failed, with the Panzer stalling right outside the city, and were forced to wait for the rest of the Sixth Army to arrive. Once Paulus's infantry arrived, the general pushed into the city, but during the interim, he ordered the city to be bombed relentlessly. On September 7th, his army advanced into the city, and vicious fighting ensued, with the Soviets not surrendering an inch of ground. The deeper the Germans got into the city, the more casualties they received. The Panzers, which were deadly in maneuver warfare, were rendered useless in the house-to-house fighting. By September 26th, the Germans reached Red Square at the cost of over 40,000 soldiers. Paulus pleaded for reinforcements from different army groups, but was ordered by Hitler to take the city at all costs. A couple days later, Paulus received a handful of reinforcements and he immediately threw them into the city. By October, the rains came in and supplies started to slow down due to the mud. The rain shortly turned to snow and supplies almost stopped coming altogether. By mid-autumn, Paulus had control of 90% of the city, but his men were low on food and ammunition. By October 19th, he ordered an offensive to try to take the remaining 10% of Stalingrad that was not in Nazi control, but was defeated and pushed back. In November, the Soviets launched a sweeping offensive on the flanks of the city and encircled Stalingrad. During the Battle of Stalingrad, Paulus developed tunnel vision and sent in his best units to try to take the city, and left his flanks poorly guarded by Romanian and Italian auxiliary troops who were forced to defend a broad front line. Soviet tanks made short work of the defenders and trapped the Sixth Army inside the city. Erich von Manstein was ordered to relieve the city in December, but failed to break the Soviet line. Paulus was under staunch orders from Hitler not to break out at any cost, and was reassured that his army would be resupplied from air. The air relief was few and far between, with a major portion of the transport planes that were supposed to be sent to relieve Stalingrad were diverted to deliver troops to counter the American landings in North Africa. Paulus was surrounded, under siege, and stuck in a hell of his own creation. His corps commanders begged the general to break out, but he refused due to being threatened that if he escaped the encirclement, that his family would be sent to a concentration camp. On January 30th, Paulus was promoted to field marshal to incentivize Paulus to take his own life instead of being captured, because no Prussian field marshal had ever been captured in battle. On February 2nd, Paulus surrendered the remnants of the Sixth Army, around 91,000 men, to Marshal Wadowski, who I just did a video about. Over 45,000 German prisoners died in the march to Soviet labor camps in Siberia. Only 9,000 of Paulus's soldiers made it out of the Soviet Union. The Battle of Stalingrad was a major turning point, as it marked the first major defeat of Hitler's forces and a major victory for the Soviets, who had mostly been losing up to that point. The battle lasted for 5 months and was one of the most bloodiest and most brutal battles of the war, with an estimated 2 million casualties. This defeat of Hitler's forces at Stalingrad was a major blow to the German war effort and was a sign that the tide was turning in favor of the Allies. It encouraged other countries to join the the Allies and increased Allied morale. It also forced Hitler to begin his long retreat from the Soviet Union and focus on other fronts, thus preventing him from launching a successful invasion of the Middle East or North Africa. Stalingrad was also used as a major symbol of Soviet resistance and defiance against Nazi aggression, and helped inspire Allied forces to continue fighting Nazi Germany, who up to that point seemed to be invincible on the battlefield. In captivity, Paulus refused to work with the Soviets, but after a few of his friends were killed in the July plot in 1944, he started collaborating with the Soviets by making radio broadcasts. As a result of these broadcasts, his family was thrown into a concentration camp. To save his own life, Paulus claimed that he had become a devout communist while in captivity. In 1946, Paulus testified at Nuremberg in exchange for seeing his wife again. After testifying against his former comrades, the Soviets refused to allow Paulus to see his wife, thus tricking him. In 1953, Paulus was released from prison and spent the rest of his life in East Germany in the city of Dresden. Paulus lived alone for a few short years and then died of ALS in 1957. Do you guys think Paulus could have won the Battle of Stalingrad? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.